Welcome to the deep dive.
Yep.
Today, we're going deep inside to look at something pretty incredible, blood flow regulation.
Hmm.
And, this is happening inside all of us right now. It's vital. Literally couldn't live without it. And lucky for us, we have a fantastic guide.
Oh, thanks.
Yeah, we're diving into Dr. Rasha Eldeeb's physiology handout. And let me tell you, it is packed with info.
It really is. I mean, it's just mind-blowing when you think about it. Your circulatory system is always adjusting, making sure that every single cell, gets what it needs. Oxygen, nutrients, it's incredible.
It really is. I mean, there's so much going on beneath the surface.
Absolutely.
We're going to break down, how blood flow is controlled, but at that microscopic level, like from those teeny tiny arterioles.
Yeah.
And all those amazing mechanisms that can shift blood based on what your body needs at that very moment.
We'll even talk about that feeling, when you uncross your legs after sitting a while.
Oh, yeah.
That rush of blood, that's actually your body showing off its amazing ability to self-regulate.
Okay, so let's start with, you mentioned arterioles. Those sound like a pretty big deal.
They are. Basically, arterioles along with metarterioles and capillary sphincters all work together.
Wow, that's a mouthful.
It is. But they act as this network, like valves, controlling blood flow into the capillaries.
So they're like the traffic directors, right?
Yeah.
Making sure everything gets where it needs to go in our circulatory system.
Perfect analogy. And the really cool part, what makes them so powerful, is their size. The diameter of an arteriole has a huge impact on how easy blood can flow through it.
Right.
The relationship is actually mathematical. If the radius doubles, blood flow increases, get this, by a factor of 16.
Wow. So a tiny adjustment creates a massive change. It's like a testament to how precisely our bodies can control blood flow. Does our brain have to, think about this?
Not at all. That's the beauty of it all. Intrinsic mechanisms, they're built-in, systems for adjusting blood flow based on what's happening right there in the tissue.
So my body just knows what to do.
It does. It's like a mini control system operating at the cellular level.
Incredible. Okay, Tell me more about these intrinsic mechanisms. How do they work?
Well, one of the big players is what we call myogenic autoregulation. So this is how arterioles respond to changes in blood pressure. Imagine you're watering your garden with a hose and the pressure suddenly spikes. What happens?
Oh yeah, the hose would expand.
Exactly. Arterioles do something similar. If blood pressure jumps up, the arteriole constricts to keep the blood flow steady.
So it's like a safety feature preventing a delicate organ from being overwhelmed with a sudden surge of pressure.
Exactly, and this is especially important for organs like the brain and the kidneys. They need a constant blood supply no matter what. If pressure fluctuates, they got to keep functioning,
Yeah, they can't afford to be offline for even a second. So that's how blood flow's regulated, based on pressure.
What about other factors, though? I imagine our metabolic needs have to play a part in how much blood flows where, right?
Mm.
Oh, absolutely. And that's where metabolic autoregulation comes in. When your cells are working hard, they create byproducts, carbon dioxide, hydrogen ions, potassium, and they're using up oxygen.
Right.
All of that signals the need for more blood flow to that area.
So it's like they're sending out an SOS. We need supplies.
That's exactly it. And the body responds, dilating those arterioles, sending in a surge of fresh blood, oxygen, and nutrients. A key player here, nitric oxide, it's naturally produced by the lining of those blood vessels. Powerful vasodilator.
It's incredible. I'm starting to see just how connected everything is in our bodies.
Yeah.
It's like this incredible web.
It really is. And speaking of connections, remember that feeling when you uncross your legs after sitting a while?
Oh, yeah, the rush of blood.
That's metabolic autoregulation in action.
We were going to talk about that, reactive hyperergemia, right?
Yeah.
So what's going on there?
Basically, you're cutting off blood flow to your lower leg when you cross them. So those byproducts build up, like we were talking about, and they send the signal, we need more blood. So you uncross your legs, and boom, arterioles open up, blood rushes back in, brings fresh oxygen, clears out those byproducts.
So our body's constantly adjusting, making sure things stay balanced, even when we, throw it a curveball by crossing our legs.
Exactly. Amazing, isn't it?
Okay, so we've covered how blood flow adjusts to pressure changes and metabolic needs, all at the local level. I'm guessing there's also, a way our bodies control blood flow on a bigger, more global scale?
Absolutely. Those intrinsic mechanisms are essential for fine-tuning at the tissue level, but we also have what we call extrinsic mechanisms for more global control.
Okay, this is getting really interesting. Tell me about these extrinsic mechanisms.
So these rely on hormones and the nervous system. They adjust blood flow based on the body's overall needs.
So it's like a central command center that coordinates everything.
That's it. And hormones are like the messengers. They travel through the bloodstream, and they send signals to tell the blood vessels whether to constrict or dilate. A good example, adrenaline. Powerful hormone causes vasoconstriction. That narrows the blood vessels, increases blood pressure.
Okay, so adrenaline's like our fight or flight hormone, right?
Yeah.
So it makes sense that's preparing us for action, increasing pressure, getting blood to where it needs to go.
Right, exactly. Then you have hormones like kinins, some prostaglandins. They're vasodilators, so they do the opposite, widen the blood vessels, decrease pressure. They're important in processes like inflammation, where you need increased blood flow to the area.
So it's like this constant push and pull with different hormones working together to keep things balanced. What about our nervous system? What role does it play?
The nervous system, especially the sympathetic nervous system, it's vital for regulating what we call blood vessel tone. It's sending signals constantly to maintain a baseline level of constriction, to keep our blood pressure in a healthy range.
So even when we're just sitting here relaxing, there's this constant activity in our nervous system making sure our blood vessels are slightly constricted.
Yes. Think of it like a subtle hand on the steering wheel, keeping everything balanced. But there are times when that baseline constriction needs to change, like during exercise, for instance.
Yeah.
The sympathetic nervous system actually causes vasodilation in the blood vessels that supply your muscles.
Wait, really? That seems kind of counterintuitive because I thought the sympathetic nervous system usually causes constriction.
You're right, but this is how adaptable our bodies are. When you exercise, your muscles need more blood flow, they need oxygen and nutrients, so the sympathetic nervous system overrides that baseline constriction, widens those blood vessels to meet the demand.
So it's not just constrict or dilate. It's about, strategically adjusting based on the body's nudge at that moment.
Precisely. It's always changing, always fine-tuning.
This is incredible. We've covered how blood flow is regulated by these tiny arterioles, by those intrinsic mechanisms responding to pressure changes and metabolic needs, and then by hormones and the nervous system, which, coordinate everything on a larger scale. I'm curious about what happens at the end of this whole intricate network, those capillaries, where oxygen and nutrients are actually exchanged.
Yes, that's where the real magic happens. It's like a bustling marketplace at the cellular level, nonstop exchange of goods coming in, waste products going out. We call this network of arterioles, capillaries, and venules, the microcirculatory unit.
Okay.
And as tiny as they are, they're absolutely crucial. We wouldn't survive without them.
I'm ready to zoom in even further and explore the world of capillaries. Let's dive in. Okay, so we're zoomed in, ready to explore these capillaries. You were describing them as like these busy marketplaces, where all those crucial exchanges take place.
Yeah, and it's actually quite fascinating because blood flow in the capillaries is pretty slow, and that's super important. It allows enough time for all those exchanges to happen, to really get everything in and out.
It makes sense. You need to slow down at a busy intersection to let everyone get where they need to go.
Exactly, exactly. Now, before we get into the capillaries themselves, there are a couple other types of vessels in those microcirculatory units we should mention: medarterioles and arteriovenous anastomoses.
Oh, okay. More names.
I know. But think of them like alternate routes or bypasses.
So if there's a traffic jam on the main capillary highway, blood can take a detour.
Exactly. Medarterioles can send blood straight from arterioles to venules, skipping the capillaries if needed. And those arteriovenous anastomoses, they're like shortcuts. They connect arterioles directly to venules, and they help regulate body temperature.
Wow, so adaptable.
Yeah.
But let's get to those capillaries. What makes them so special?
Well, first off, they're tiny, just wide enough for a single red blood cell to squeeze through. Yeah, it's like this narrow passageway that forces the red blood cells to slow down even more, maximizing their contact with the capillary walls, and that really helps the exchange process.
So it's like this slow motion dance, each red blood cell making its deliveries and pickups.
That's a great way to put it. So how do things actually move across those capillary walls, right? Seems like it would be a logistical nightmare.
Yeah.
Remember those Stirling forces? We talked about them earlier.
Oh, yeah, those pressure gradients, hydrostatic, pushing fluid out, osmotic, pulling it back in.
Right. And they're at work here, too, in the capillaries. So at the beginning of the capillary, the arteriolar end, that hydrostatic pressure is higher than the osmotic pressure.
Got it.
Which means there's this outward force, pushing fluid from the capillaries out into the tissue.
So nutrients, oxygen, all that good stuff getting delivered to the cells.
That's it. It's called filtration. But then, as the blood moves along the capillary, that hydrostatic pressure, it starts to drop. And by the time it gets to the venous end, the hydrostatic pressure is actually lower than the osmotic pressure.
So now the osmotic pressure is in charge, pulling fluid back into those capillaries.
Exactly. Exactly. That's absorption. So it really is a carefully choreographed dance, fluid flowing out at one end, back in at the other, and that keeps the tissues healthy and prevents them from getting waterlogged.
I love that analogy.
Yeah.
But not all the fluid that gets pushed out gets reabsorbed, right?
Right, otherwise we'd be swelling up all the time. That's where our good friend, the lymphatic system, comes in again.
Oh, right.
Those lymphatic vessels collect that excess fluid and return it to the bloodstream. Plus, they're busy fighting off those bad guys, transporting white blood cells and filtering out harmful stuff. They're always multitasking.
Like a cleanup crew, keeping things tidy.
Exactly, but we still need to talk about those other substances, the oxygen, nutrients, and waste products. How do they move between the blood and the tissues?
Yeah, is that all driven by those pressure gradients too?
Not entirely, no. While fluid movement is mainly about those gradients, the exchange of solutes, like, oxygen, nutrients, and waste, that mostly relies on diffusion.
Oh, right. Diffusion, that's the movement of molecules from high concentration to low concentration.
You got it. So let's say blood's entering the capillaries, full of oxygen. The surrounding tissues have used up some of their oxygen, so they have a lower concentration. That difference creates a driving force. Oxygen moves from the capillaries to the tissues, just like that.
It's like nature's way of balancing things out, from where there's plenty to where it's needed.
Precisely.
Yep.
And it works the same way for nutrients and waste products. Nutrients move from the blood, where there's more of them, to the tissues where they're needed. Waste products go the other way, from the tissues to the blood to be carried away for removal.
It's like a perfectly balanced two-way street. But does the size of the molecule matter?
That's a great question. It definitely does. So small molecules like oxygen and carbon dioxide, they can easily slip right through those cell membranes of the capillary walls.
Okay.
This allows for really fast diffusion, which is super important for, gas exchange.
Got it. So those smaller molecules, they have a VIP pass, they can skip the line. What about bigger molecules like glucose or amino acids? How do they get through?
They need a different path. So
Yeah.
capillary walls, they have these tiny pores between the endothelial cells. Those act like channels, allowing those larger water-soluble molecules to pass through.
So it's like different entry points based on size and what the molecule's made of. What about really big molecules, though? Proteins, for example, can they get through?
For the most part, proteins are too big to fit through those pores, and that's actually important because we need to keep a certain concentration of proteins in our blood to maintain that osmotic pressure, to prevent edema.
Right. So it's like a delicate balance.
Exactly, but there are exceptions. That's where those different types of capillaries come in, the continuous, fenestrated, and sinusoid capillaries.
Oh, right. You mentioned those before. So they each have like different levels of permeability.
Exactly. Continuous capillaries are the most restrictive. They have really tight junctions, and you find them in places like the brain, where it's really important to be picky about what gets in and out. Fenestrated capillaries, they have small pores, so they're more permeable. You'll see those in places like the kidneys and intestines, where filtration and absorption are key.
It's like different levels of security based on the location.
Exactly. And then we have the sinusoid capillaries. They have the largest gaps between those endothelial cells. And even bigger molecules, like proteins, can pass through. You find these in the liver and the spleen, where exchanging large proteins is necessary.
So it's not just about pressure gradients and diffusion. The actual structure of the capillaries matters too.
You got it. Everything plays a role. Now, what about white blood cells?
Oh yeah, those are essential for our immune system. And I know they can move out of blood vessels to fight infections in tissues. How do they do that?
White blood cells are special. They can actually squeeze themselves between those endothelial cells, even though they're bigger than the pores. We call it diapedesis.
They're like tiny contortionists.
That's it. Diapedesis allows them to quickly leave the bloodstream and get to where they need to be, fight invaders or fix damage.
So we've got diffusion, pores, diapedesis. Any other ways that things can cross those capillary walls?
There's one more we should mention, transcytosis. That's how really, really big molecules like certain proteins are transported. They get carried across the endothelial cells in little tiny vesicles.
So even the big guys have a way to get across. It's amazing how many different mechanisms our bodies use.
It really highlights just how complex and efficient our circulatory system is. But as we've touched on before, this whole delicate balance, it can get disrupted. And when that happens, you can end up with edema, that buildup of fluid in the tissues.
Right, and we've talked about how high blood pressure or low protein levels can cause it, but it seems like there's more to it than that.
Yeah, there is. Edema can also happen if the permeability of the capillaries increases, meaning those gaps between the endothelial cells, they get wider, so more fluid can escape. And then problems with the lymphatic system, like, blockages or damage, those can lead to fluid buildup too.
So many ways that things can get thrown off balance.
Hmm.
But I'm guessing our bodies have some ways to try to prevent edema, right?
Of course. We talked about how the low compliance of subcutaneous tissues helps limit swelling. It's like trying to overfill a stiff container. It just resists that expansion.
Right, right. And increased lymph flow helps to wash away that excess protein.
Exactly. And then there's the regulation of capillary permeability itself. The size and number of those pores, they can change, to control how much fluid in those solutes can pass through.
It's like a valve, tightening or loosening as needed.
Precisely. And don't forget about those hormones. Aldosterone is produced by the adrenal glands, and it helps regulate sodium and water reabsorption in the kidneys. That's really important for maintaining blood volume, preventing edema.
So many factors working together just to keep things balanced. It's really impressive.
It truly is.
This deep dive has been so insightful. I'm really starting to see the bigger picture. How all these systems and processes, they're all connected in this incredibly intricate way.
That's what makes physiology so fascinating. It's all interconnected.
I'm really curious to learn more about what can go wrong with this balance, how different types of edema show up.
Well, we'll dive into that in our next segment. Stay tuned.
Welcome back to the deep dive. We've been on this incredible journey exploring blood flow regulation, and I'm ready to learn more about what happens when this carefully tuned system goes haywire.
Well, think of it as a network, pipes and valves, all working together to maintain this delicate balance. And as we talked about, if something goes wrong, you can get edema, that fluid buildup in the tissues.
Right. We talked about some general causes: high blood pressure, low protein, problems with the lymphatic system. But
Yeah.
Can we get into specific types of edema? How do they actually show up in the body?
Sure. Let's start with high pressure edema. This often happens in folks with heart failure. So imagine your heart's a pump, right? Constantly working, circulating that blood. If the pump weakens, well, it can't push as effectively.
So the blood backs up, almost like a traffic jam in the circulatory system.
Exactly. And that backup increases pressure in the veins, and that translates to higher pressure in the capillaries. So that increased hydrostatic pressure, it just overwhelms the osmotic pressure that would normally pull fluid back into the capillaries.
So the capillaries are being forced to release more fluid than they can reabsorb.
Precisely. And, gravity plays a role here too.
Yeah.
You often see this type of edema in the lower extremities, the legs, ankles.
Okay, that makes sense, like water settling at the lowest point. It's amazing how something like just fluid buildup can be a sign of a bigger problem.
It is. It reminds us how interconnected everything is in the body. Let's switch gears, talk about low colloid osmotic pressure edema. This one's all about protein.
Oh, right. We talked about how proteins like albumin are key for maintaining that osmotic pressure. So if there's not enough protein in the blood, then the osmotic pressure drops, and it's harder to draw fluid back into the capillaries, right?
Exactly. Think of albumin like a magnet, attracting those water molecules, keeping the fluid inside those blood vessels. Not enough albumin, that magnetic pull weakens, and fluid can leak out into those tissues.
So the capillaries lose their grip on the fluid.
Yeah, I like that. Now, this can happen in situations like, malnutrition, where there just isn't enough protein in the diet, or kidney disease, where proteins are lost in the urine.
Wow, so the body is losing those essential building blocks.
Yeah.
Okay, what about permeability edema? That one sounded serious, leaky capillaries.
It can be, yeah. In permeability edema, those capillaries become more permeable, meaning larger molecules, even proteins, can escape into the tissues. This can happen with, burns, inflammation, or allergic reactions.
So those tiny pores between the cells, they get bigger, creating gaps that shouldn't be there.
Exactly. And when those proteins leak out, they throw off the osmotic pressure, which makes the fluid buildup even worse.
It's like the capillaries can't hold on to the fluid anymore.
Yeah.
Okay, let's talk about lymphatic edema. What's happening there?
So remember, the lymphatic system's our drainage system. It's supposed to collect excess fluid and return it to the blood.
Right.
But if those lymphatic vessels get blocked or damaged, the fluid builds up. That's lymphatic edema.
So the pipes get clogged. Why would that happen?
Lots of reasons. Surgery, radiation, infection, even certain parasites. It's often a chronic condition, and yeah, it can be tough if it's not managed well.
Wow, so there's this whole range of edema, each with a different underlying cause. Fluid balance is so important.
It is, and this really highlights how our body systems are all connected. Even small imbalances can have big consequences.
This deep dive has been so eye-opening. We've explored how blood flow is controlled, at the microscopic level, the role of those amazing capillaries, and what happens when that balance gets disrupted. I have such a newfound appreciation for how complex our bodies are.
It really is remarkable, isn't it? All these systems working together to keep us going and understanding it all, well, that's a big step towards staying healthy.
Absolutely. I know I'm going to be way more mindful of my circulatory health from now on. Thank you so much for guiding us through this. It's been incredible.
My pleasure.
And to all our listeners, thanks for joining us. We hope you learned a thing or two and that you have a new appreciation for the wonders of your own body. Stay curious and keep exploring. We'll see you next time on The Deep Dive.